Are
we just doing out? Are we doing like
little lecture tour? So we're gonna start off with the gold standard, and to get an idea of what went on there. The history of some of our stuff as it relates to exchange rates. Okay, so before we do that, let's look at exchange rate regimes. Exchange rate regimes. Okay, so a floating regime is one that's just subject to market forces. So the exchange rate is going to float against other currencies with no intervention. So value of currency is allowed to freely adjust, to freely fluctuate against other currencies. And the alternative for that, or one alternative, it's really modifications of the two, is a fixed exchange rate regime, where we're going to peg it against another currency. So the value of the currency is pegged, is the word we use, pegged relative to the value of another. And that is called the anchor currency. And then the last one's just kind of a hybrid of the two, called a managed float. A managed float, or the more fun term is a dirty float. So a managed or dirty float is kind of what it sounds like. We're going to mostly let it float, but we're going to intervene if we feel like it's getting a little too low, or we might keep it fixed for a period of time and then allow it to adjust. So value is kind of managed at discretion of government. So it may be fixed for a little bit, may be fixed for a period of time, so a lot of what this chapter focuses in on is on these interventions and what that means and what the implications are for governments taking this approach, is where a lot of the chapter's on, is the intervention into the markets. The floating one's a little bit easier, just kind of what it is what it is. So similar to our theme in a number of different things, how does government intervention help or hurt the situation? Are there secondary effects that need to be taken into account? Okay, any questions on those three? So those are kind of the three extremes, or the three areas of possibilities. And so historically, we had a gold standard. And the amount of currency in circulation, the supply of money was fixed to gold. We've talked about that before. But what was then its implication on exchange rates? Well, that would essentially make them fixed as well. So having a gold standard also fixed exchange rates. Since you can't, alter money the way we've done before. So the thing that we have talked about before, just worth noting here again, is the gold standard means there was no control over monetary policy. There was no monetary policy, essentially, if you want to think of it that way. The quantity of money was completely determined by the amount of gold reserves, and therefore taking any discretionary power out of any politician or government bureaucrat. So, how did the money supply change? This is not something that's immediately obvious, but just want to make sure you're thinking through all the logic here. The supply of gold, yeah. So how do we find gold? Gold rush of 1876 or whatever in California, we find more gold. That does affect the supply of money. I mean, it is that's the connection here. And I have a short video that we're going to look at here in a bit too. So the money supply, change in money supply occurs with production and discovery of gold. That is historically been a very slow, stable thing. So we didn't have big spikes in monetary activity. That's one of the reasons gold was chosen, is that it tended to be pretty slow and stable in its discovery and production. Okay, so the gold standard started to fall apart for reasons we'll talk about later. But I do want to add in the next one that'll be in this video, and then we'll watch the video. So the Bretton Woods system, which got its name from the city that it was located in, I think it was up in Connecticut or something, up in the Northeast. So this was a modification that happened in World War II. Among the winners of the war, so not the Nazi Germans, the winners decided, hey, we got to fix this exchange rate thing. It got kind of messed up with the wars and other things going on. And so what it did is it fixed exchange rates to the US dollar. Fixed exchange rates to the US dollar. Which was fixed to gold. So then essentially it was kind of a slight modification. Instead of having to actually ship gold overseas, because literally there was a problem there with the gold reserves that each country had, we decided we'll fix it all to the US dollar. The United States then was always the redeemer of gold. At any point in time, any country or whatever could say, hey, I've got some British pounds here, I want my gold, right? And so they just served as the clearinghouse, in a sense, for the gold at that point. Okay, questions there? Let's watch this little video next here.
When Rose first started with us, she was just coming out of the hospital. It's been a better...
Before we move on to current events, it's vital to know how we got here. I will now present an extremely shortened version of recent U.S. monetary history. The purpose of this section is to show you that the U.S. government has radically shifted the rules during times of emergency, and that our monetary system is really a lot younger than you might think. After the panic of 1907, when private banker J.P. Morgan intervened as the lender of last resort, banks began agitating for a government solution. What was finally decided upon in 1913 was a federally sponsored cartel called the Federal Reserve, which sounded governmental, but really was not. The stock of the Federal Reserve was to be held by its member banks, not the U.S. government, nor the public, which remains the case today. So what we call the Federal Reserve actually is a federally sponsored banking cartel, licensed to lend money into existence. By the 1930s, a federally reserve-fueled speculative bubble had burst, resulting in numerous bank failures, which shrank the money supply by nearly a third in 3 years. Despite being chartered as a lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve failed to halt a catastrophic banking collapse. In 1933, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to counter the falling money supply in a most drastic manner. To accomplish this, he confiscated all privately held gold and immediately devalued the U.S. dollar. Prior to the seizure, it took approximately $21 to buy an ounce of gold, and afterwards, it took $35. Soon after, contractual obligations of the U.S. government, such as bonds payable in gold, were nullified with the approval of the Supreme Court. This goes to show how governments in a period of emergency can change rules and break their own laws. All of the seized gold either ended up in the vaults of the Federal Reserve or at the International Monetary Fund or on the books of the Federal Reserve. A grand total of $11 billion was exchanged for all 261 million ounces of the nation's gold. In other words, complete control of the gold supply of the most powerful and prosperous nation on earth was exchanged for $11 billion printed out of thin air, creating some very serious storage hardships for the Federal Reserve. I mean, have you ever tried lifting 70-pound gold bricks that high over your head? In any event, to end the turmoil of depression and war, and to provide a foundation for global recovery, a conference was held at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, with all the major Allied powers attending. Recognizing that the U.S. then represented nearly half of the global economy, the U.S. dollar was made the global reserve currency. All other currencies had fixed rates of exchange to the dollar, which in turn was redeemable for gold at $35 per ounce. The Bretton Woods II system ushered in a period of prosperity and rapid economic recovery. But there was a flaw in the system. Nothing in the Bretton Woods Agreement prevented the U.S. Federal Reserve from expanding the supply of Federal Reserve notes. As this happened, the gold backing behind each dollar steadily declined, such that there was not enough gold to back all of the dollars. Meanwhile, as the Vietnam War intensified, the U.S. was running budget deficits and flooding the world with paper dollars. The French, under President Charles de Gaulle, became suspicious that the U.S. would be unable to honor its Bretton Woods obligations to redeem their excess dollars into gold. As the French exchanged their surplus dollars for gold, the U.S. Treasury's gold stocks declined alarmingly. Finally, President Nixon declared force majeure on August 15, 1971, and slammed the gold window, ending its dollar convertibility. That's what governments do during wartime, and the U.S. followed the pattern perfectly. But this time, it affected the whole world because the removal of gold convertibility of the dollar destroyed the foundation of the Bretton Woods system. Without a gold backing, there was no hard physical limit to how many paper dollars could be issued. Since we now know that all dollars are backed by debt, what do you suppose happened to U.S. debt levels once the externally applied rigor of gold was removed? Let's find out. This is a chart of U.S. federal debt from the period of 1949 to 2004. Note that it looks like any other exponential chart you've already reviewed, but especially note that the graph turns the corner shortly after Nixon slammed the gold window. That is, when Nixon removed the last vestige of external physical restraint from the system. And also note how rapidly the debt levels have climbed recently. These past few years have seen the highest and most rapid accumulation of federal debt in our entire history, thanks in large measure to an experiment never before attempted in our country's history: the conduct of 2 foreign wars and a tax cut at the same time. This rapid accumulation of debt is not a mysterious process at all. Rather, it's an entirely predictable consequence of the slamming of the gold window.
I can't remember when he did this video, but what's the current debt?
Like 13.
It's like 18, so it's double. Take this as far as accentuating this hockey stick.
What's the last year?
That's what I was trying to think. I think it's 2004, and then he laid on a couple more. So I think this is like 2007, 2008. I think he did this shortly before the financial crisis. But I just thought I'd point that out on this scale that skyrocketed up.
How much longer can this continue? Unfortunately, there's no good answer to this besides, as long as foreigners let us. A second, predictable and related consequence concerns the total amount of money in circulation. Remember, all money is loaned into existence, so the shape of the federal debt chart should tip you off to the shape of this next chart of U.S. money from the years 1959 to 2007. The first thing we can note here is that it took our country over 300 years, from the very first pilgrim until 1973, to generate our first $1 trillion of money stock. Every road, every bridge, every marketplace on every corner of every town, every boat, and every building, from the first colony until 1973, required $1 trillion of money stock. Our most recent $1 trillion, that was created in the last 4.5 months. My questions to you are these. What will it be like to live here when our nation is creating $1 trillion every 4 weeks? How about every 4 days? What about every 4 hours? 4 minutes? Where does this stop if not in hyperinflation and the destruction of the dollar, and by extension, our nation? If we view these events on a timeline, we can see that the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913, and that only 20 years later, in 1933, our country had entered a form of bankruptcy and had turned over its collective gold supply under force of law to the Federal Reserve. 11 years after that, the US dollar was enshrined as the world's reserve currency with an explicit backing by gold. That was unilaterally removed by Nixon 27 years later. In effect, the current global monetary system of unbacked currencies is now only 37 years old. It was not planned, but simply emerged out of a crisis. The unredeemable US dollar remains a popular reserve currency as a matter of convenience, but nothing requires or guarantees that it will retain this role. Only the US is able to use its eroding reserve currency status to borrow and print dollars to pay for its trade deficits. However, as the dollar loses its reserve currency status from this abuse, the US will be forced to either export more to pay for its imports, or to take on ever heavier levels of debt. If these actions cause the dollar to keep falling, other countries will be tempted to devalue their currencies to keep pace and remain competitive. The potential for an inflationary period is evident, which brings us to the next section.
Okay, comments on the video? Now, what's happened since that video, I was kind of touting the exact same thing, and we haven't seen that inflation kick in. So we're still kind of waiting on when is it coming. And a large part of the answer to that story has been not of banks just holding on to money, as we've talked about in other chapters and maybe in Money and Banking, that banks aren't loaning out that money, it's just kind of being hoarded. And so we continue to see this kind of slow recovery. But I still maintain the same thing I said 5 years ago, although I thought it would come to roost a lot sooner, that as soon as the United States starts really kicking in and being more productive and that money gets out in the system, it's, from an economic standpoint, inevitable that it should be leading to some inflation. And not sure if all the central bank gurus have it all figured out. I don't think they do, because I've listened to enough economists who say that they don't have any, they didn't get it. I listened to plenty of other Yale economists and other high-end economists that they don't have any better answers than anybody else. So it's kind of a interesting time for inflationary concerns for the United States. So we'll see how it all plays out. All right. So a couple other things that this chapter brings out that came out of the Bretton Woods era, and that is some organizations as it relates to international trade. Probably one of the more important ones was the GATT. So the General agreement. The general agreement on tariffs and trade. Came out of this Bretton Woods arrangement as well. So post-World War II. And this later turned into the World Trade Organization, which is now the governing body or agreement of especially developed countries that agree on certain rules that were established in tariffs and trade, all agreeing that free trade is good, rah rah free trade, lower trade barriers, and so that is what the kind of falls under the WTO's umbrella. Another entity is that came out of World War II was the World Bank. So I just want to get you at least these big international institutions, and because sometimes there's a shroud of mystery of, oh, there's some big rich guy that controls the rules. He owns the World Bank, every share of it. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The World Bank now serves developing countries. So developed countries kind of help support developing countries in various types of assistance. And the World Bank was also trying to restore some of the countries that were destroyed during World War II, so Germany, post-war Germany, and that, so that was part of what is like, oh, we're helping this country that was in rough shape. Now there's other countries in rough shape once they helped Germany, and then they just kind of moved on to, that's how its mission changed over time. And then the last one that we'll spend more time on, but this seems like a good place to put it in, is the International Monetary Fund. The IMF. And this is kind of the collective voice for developed country rules. So if you're a member of the fund, then you get certain privileges. If your country starts to go broke, like Greece is right now, then you can go to the IMF and kind of get a little bit of a bailout loan, but they're not just going to dish that out to anybody. They're going to start to maybe put some austerity measures, some restrictions on, hey, we'll give you a loan this time, shame on you, but you were really stupid with your money and I want you to do this from now on. So you kind of get that lecture, and then that loan, that bailout loan, will come with conditions that hopefully sets them on a path for longer term prosperity. And so Greece is right now, this is in the headlines within the last month, are looking to maybe default on their loan. And so the big thing is, are we going to bail them out again, or are we going to let them go? So that's kind of a hot topic now. All right. So yeah, let's do this, and then we'll get into Allison here. So what does it mean to intervene when you have a fixed exchange rate? So how fixed exchange works in the market. So in this chapter, we'll start to broaden your brains a little bit to thinking this is quantity of domestic assets. Last chapter, we pretty much stuck with dollars here, which meant that it was euros per dollar here. This chapter, I told you that we might do this on you. We might flip it around and say that this is the amount of Vietnamese dong, and this is dollars per dong here. And then if E goes up, it's the appreciation of the dong, not the dollar, right? So we kind of got to be able to go back and forth with that. Okay, so quantity of domestic assets, and then you got your exchange rate here. And let's go ahead and put in a supply and demand curve. And let's say that currently the government wishes to maintain this exchange rate, which we're just going to put subscript par as the notation that your book is using. So the E par, that's what we're trying to keep fixed. Okay, so if there ends up being an increase in demand for dong to D2, under a floating exchange rate regime, we'd see appreciation, right? So the exchange rate would float up to here. So if we want to maintain par here, what sort of intervention needs to be done? Okay, so we're going to be thinking in terms of the demand, because we're still maintaining this supply curve fixed. So let's try to imagine what's going on here in the marketplace with an increase in demand for dong. What would the government need to do with their little reserve? So here's the Vietnamese government, central bank. Do people want to buy dong or not? Yes, right? So there's an increase in demand for dong. U.S. government says, hey, I got dong. In fact, I can print them off if I want, right? So then what they're going to do is start to supply dong to the market, which luckily they can do, right? It is, right? But this supply here is all of a relative drop in the water, so we don't show that as a shift here. So because we're focusing in on the exchange rate market. So just imagine this is just a Goliath that, yes, there's an increase, but it doesn't really shift it. The bigger effect from exchange rate purpose is going to be through the interest rates and capital flows. But for now, we can think of this. What is, if they're bringing dong here, what are they acquiring? They're acquiring dollars. If the dollar has maintained to be the reserve currency of the world or whatever, it's not necessarily dollars, but they're bringing in, let's say, U.S. dollars into their vault, if you will. And that's the thing we talked about on Monday, that is their international reserves. And so that's how their balances of different currencies would start to change. And so that's what's going on here, which would then shift the demand curve back to D1 through that intervention. Okay, and then if we have a shift to, let's call it D3, we're just going to undo what we were doing. So here, people are trying to unload their, there's a decrease in the demand for dong, and we're going to reverse this path with dollars are going to start flowing out, dong are going to start coming back in. We're just going to undo that process. If the currency was floating, then there would be depreciation, but we're not going to allow that to happen. We're going to try to keep it at par. But if this continues, there's a problem with this method. They might run out, right? So they only have so much reserve currency. If the central bank ultimately runs out of reserves, then their hands are tied. They have to devalue. They would have to ratchet it down. And so we'll expand that more on Friday when we get there. But I wanted to at least get your juices flowing here on how the fixed exchange rate works. Okay, questions on that? All right, so let's talk Allison here.